Many of the complaints of the Protestant Reformation were based on real problems. There were real problems within the church that they were reacting to. And the early reformers, even the ones that would become Protestants, did not necessarily understand themselves as rebelling from the Catholic Church. And in fact, many of the reformers that predated the Reformation didn't break with the church. Many reform-minded people stayed solidly within the church and continued to seek its internal reform. And this imperative to reform became more and more obvious as the Protestant Reformation gained steam. It became obvious to much of the leadership within the Catholic Church that if the church was going to stop the spread of Protestantism and was going to reconvert some of its flock that had left, they had to get its own house in order. So the movement of internal reform within the church was accelerated because of the Protestant Reformation. And because of this, it's often called the Counter-Reformation, the Catholic Counter-Reformation. And that's not inaccurate, but we could just as easily describe it as a Catholic Reformation or a Catholic reform movement in and of itself. So one of these reform movements that had predated the Reformation and that continued to have massive influence during the Reformation was called the Devotia Moderna, or the modern devotion. And this was really a spiritual movement that focused on individual spiritual growth. And it stressed the need for a personal conversion or a personal relationship and encounter with Jesus Christ himself. We can see here how the impulses that animated many Protestants, such as the emphasis on the individual's encounter with Christ, could be brought into and so reinvigorate orthodoxy. So this movement minimized much of the external devotions that had dominated the late Middle Ages. Remember, I talked about the spirituality of the late Middle Ages and the sort of form that Catholicism had taken through the 14th and into the 15th century. And it was characterized by an increasingly legalistic or sort of mechanical understanding of the sacraments or how grace worked. So the Devotio Moderna is trying to counteract that by remaining solidly within the Catholic Church, but emphasizing really an internal spiritual event or conversion. So this movement has wide influence in the church, both before and after the Reformation. And one person who was significantly influenced by it was a Spanish soldier named Ignatius Loyola. He had been a very worldly man, and then he was wounded. And during his recovery, during his recuperation, he had a very powerful conversion experience along the lines of this modern devotion. He became a priest in 1540 and established the Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits. So these Jesuits, this new order, became one of the most powerful forces of the Catholic Reformation. And the order sought an intense personal spiritual communion with God and believed that individual holiness was possible to all Christians, which was, of course, what had animated the High Middle Ages. So what you're seeing with the Jesuits and the spirituality that they're advancing is a sort of recapitulation or a re-offering of the traditional Catholic understanding of the universal call to holiness. So they taught that grace was necessary for this conversion, and that the grace flowed through the church and her sacraments. So even though they're emphasizing a personal conversion and a personal experience, they're maintaining that the grace that makes that possible flows through the structures of the church and the sacramental system in particular. So an example of this would be when the Jesuits became the masters of the confessional. And they really developed the practice of using the confessional, the sacrament of confession, as a means of spiritual healing, sometimes even to the point of spiritual direction. Now, in the late Middle Ages, as a part of this sort of legalistic or mechanical understanding of the church, the sacrament of confession had sometimes been corrupted into a sort of legal or transactional arrangement where the penitent confessed his sins and the confessor gave a penance and then absolved the sinner. And it was really sort of transactional with not a lot of internal focus. So the Jesuits, however, approach confession as an integral aspect of spiritual formation. So we can see then in this example how the impulses that animated many of the Protestants, such as an emphasis on the individual's encounter with Christ, could be brought into and so reinvigorate orthodoxy. The Jesuits were also extremely disciplined, and they took a special vow of obedience to the Pope. They were innovators, though. So even though they had this loyalty to the papacy, they have an intense devotion to the sacraments and insistence upon the importance of the sacraments, they were still understood as being innovative and even very dangerous. In fact, it was not uncommon in the late 16th century and into the early 17th century for many conservatives within the Catholic Church to accuse the Jesuits of actually being Protestants, of actually being Calvinists even. But the Jesuits were on the very front lines then of the Counter-Reformation, and they established schools throughout Europe to strengthen Reformed Catholicism. The Jesuits were just one of many orders that were either started or reformed in the period, and they all have a similar focus on this internal growth into holiness. The most important event in the Catholic Reformation was the Council of Trent, which met from 1545 to 1563. Now, since the Reformation had began, there had been calls for a council, of course, right? The popes had been in favor of such a gathering. Councils were the way that these kinds of major doctrinal problems had been solved in the past. But a council had been impossible, basically impossible for 30 years, largely because of political fights between the Holy Roman Emperor and the French. So because of this, and because they control their churches, especially the French controls the church in their country, the French monarchy does, then they could kind of hold the council hostage in order to wrestle political benefits, and that's what they did. Now, they finally managed to have a council gather in 1545, but by this time, the positions had hardened among the Reformation factions. The council met, and instead of really being an attempt at winning Protestants back to orthodoxy through some sort of doctrinal compromise, which had been what people had wanted the council to be earlier, it really developed largely into a Catholic response to Protestantism. So a reformation of Catholicism against Protestant doctrine. So one of the things the council does really is approach the teaching of Luther systematically. So it determines things like Luther is mistaken about Scripture being the only source of revelation, and it asserts here that there's also tradition as a valid source of revelation, or a crucial and necessary source of revelation as well. It defined the books of the Bible to include the Greek books of the Old Testament, which Luther had removed. Luther's doctrine of justification without works was condemned. Luther had maintained that there were only two sacraments, baptism and the Eucharist. The council countered by reiterating the ancient tradition that there were, in fact, 7 sacraments. And then the council continues to go through these 7 sacraments, expounding what they are, their natures, and how they work. And throughout all of this exposition, Luther is really the target, Luther and Calvin. So the council offers then a wholesale repudiation of Luther's system. And it's at the same time, it's offering a dynamic restatement of Catholic orthodoxy. It also, though, set out with more traditional reform, to establish more traditional reform. So it emphasized, for example, the importance of preaching, the pastoral duties of bishops, and prohibited clergy from holding multiple positions or multiple offices within the church, or pluralism, as that's called. Now, these sorts of reforming movements, the reforming aspects, were again, kind of like we saw with the Jesuits, a sort of veiled acknowledgement of the Protestant complaints. The ignorance of the clergy, for example, had been a constant Protestant complaint. One of the things that the Protestants had asserted against the church was that the clergy was corrupt and ignorant. And so now the council emphasizes or insists that the clergy become not only holy, but educated. And so they demand the establishment of the seminary system so that bishops will establish seminaries for the training of their priests. The Council of Trent came to a close in 1562. And it's one of the church's great epochal councils, similar to the Council of Nicaea in 325 or Lateran IV in 1215. So like Nicaea, Trent had been called to deal with a doctrinal crisis and concluded by asserting Orthodox doctrine in a manner that was appropriate to face that crisis. And then like Lateran IV, it sought to institutionalize reform and to construct a church worthy of her universal calling. So this Catholic Reformation was just one aspect of what historians often call the period of confessionalization. And this is the period right after that initial wave of Reformation. So in the second half of the 16th century and then through the 17th century. And this is the period where the various kingdoms of Europe become confessional states. And that's the reason why it's called confessionalization. And one of the aspects of this movement was the creation of the confessions themselves. So before the Reformation, there's no notion of multiple religions or multiple distinct branches of Christianity that were somehow definitively sealed off from each other. The church was one. The medieval church had been one, even though it had allowed for great diversity between different lands and among different peoples. And during the first generation of the Reformation, this idea had stayed pretty much intact. Everyone involved, all the various factions, were attempting to reform the church as a whole and to keep the unity of the church intact. However, as the conflict wore on, people's positions began to harden. So as factions increasingly defined themselves against each other, the hopes of reconciliation faded, and a Europe of distinct Christian confessions emerged. And we saw this, we could see this with the way I described Trent, right? So at Trent, you see the Catholic Church really defining itself, so defining sort of what it meant to be Catholic, what was the Catholic Church, by pointing out where Luther was wrong. So what that means is that after Trent, Catholicism is in a sense defined against Lutheranism. So Lutheranism is now sort of an aspect of what it means to be Catholic, only a negative one. Now the Lutherans do the same thing. In 1580, they issued the Book of Concord, which articulated a Lutheran system of belief that directly excluded the possibility of Catholic orthodoxy. The Calvinists did the same thing in 1563 with their Heidelberg Catechism. So by the end of the century, by 1600, it's clear that there are multiple distinct forms of Christianity that are known as confessions, and that each is defined, at least in part, as not being the other. So reconciliation becomes an actual impossibility within the logic of the confessions themselves. These new confessions remained fundamentally tied to politics, just as Christianity and politics had been really the two aspects of the same thing in the Middle Ages. That unity remains. In fact, like we saw, it was really the drive of the princes to consolidate power in their own realms that drove this confessionalization process forward. So they wanted to unify their people against each other. This is one of the reasons against the other princes. This is one of the chief motivations behind confessionalization itself. In fact, it was largely the drive of princes to consolidate the power in their realms by unifying their own people against outsiders that drove the process of confessionalization forward. With